Episode 5 from the 5th chapter of my #1 best-selling book on Amazon, How to Become a Barnabas Leader. The Testimony of Bill Meyers, a true-life mob story with a happy ending. It was in Atlanta that I first met Bill Meyers at the offices of NFL Hall of Fame quarterback Fran Tarkenton on the 33rd floor of an office building in Buckhead. Bill and I had been both contracted with Tarkenton Financial in the retirement insurance business. On the first Monday morning of each month, Bill coordinated a conference call for a handful of Tarkenton agents who are Christians for a short Bible devotional and time of prayer. Fran and his son Matt graciously supported this group. One day, Bill handed me a CD recording of his testimony about how he came to believe in Jesus Christ. This true story is so spectacular that I got Bill's permission to burn several copies onto CDs and handed them out. He once again graciously granted me permission to share his story here in this book. Here below is Bill's amazing story in his own words.
There's a testimony, and a testimony is like when you're in a court of law and you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And this is my testimony regarding what Jesus Christ did in my life. I was born and raised in the Bronx in New York City, the oldest of 4 boys. My father was a Jewish man, but he was not religious. He told my mom she could raise us however she wanted, and my mom was an Italian lady, and her religion was Roman Catholic, and that's how she raised us. Kind of made me a Jewapi, I guess you could say. I, as an infant, was baptized. At the age of 8, had my first Holy Communion. At the age of 12, I received my confirmation. And that was the basis of my religious experience. I went to church faithfully. Every Wednesday, I would be released from school a little early to go to religious instruction. And that was basically my experience until I was old enough to not have to go to church anymore. And then it would become a thing of, Christmas Eve, midnight mass, that type of thing. And that was it. My father was a working man. We had a normal existence. I was in the Little League. I was in the Cub Scouts. And for all intents and purposes, I had a normal life. At one point, I'd say I was around 13 years old or so, my dad decided that he was going to move us out of the Bronx in the neighborhood we were living. Things were starting to get rough around that time. A lot of people were starting to use different drugs, although I was kind of clueless about that in terms of what the specifics. He decided he was going to move us to a place called Yonkers, New York, and that's what we did. And life continued on. By this time now, I was approaching, say, around 15 years old. It was the mid-'60s in this country, and in the whole Western world, the hippie phenomenon was starting to take root. And everybody was doing everything that all the groups did. The popular bands at the time, and it sounds a little corny even to hear myself say it now, but groups like The Who and the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, these were the groups that everybody was into. And whatever the groups did, that's what we did. As their hair got longer, so did ours. As their clothing started to change, so did ours. And as the group started experimenting with drugs and getting high, that's what everybody started doing. Everybody except Billy. My friends knew if we'd be driving around in somebody's car and they would pass a joint around, my friends knew not to even pass it to me, not to even waste their time trying to get me to take it, because I wouldn't do it. Peer pressure then was nothing to me, because I had something else in the back of mine. It's called dad pressure. See, I had remembered a conversation I had overheard when I was a little kid, maybe about 8 years old. We were still living in the Bronx at the time, and this one evening I was sitting on the living room floor watching television. My dad and my Uncle Joe, my mom's brother, were sitting in the kitchen. They were talking, and I was not eavesdropping, but all of a sudden they started talking about a man that they had known. And my Uncle Joe said to my dad, he said, "Oh, Willie, didn't you hear? He died." And my dad said, "Well, how did he die?" And my Uncle Joe said, "He OD'd on stuff." Now, I'm sitting there as a little 8-year-old, and I promise you I had no clue at all what that meant. OD'd, I didn't know what that meant. And stuff, I had no idea. But the next thing I heard sent a chill, and to this day, I'm almost 49 years old as I'm speaking right now. I can still remember it like it was yesterday. I heard my dad lower his voice and say to my Uncle Joe, "If I ever catch my kid messing with that stuff, I'll put him in his grave." And I didn't know what it was he was talking about, but all I decided to myself was that this was going to be very detrimental to my health, and I wasn't going to get involved with it at all. Well, when you fast forward a few years, now I'm a big wise guy, 15 years old, hanging around with my friends. Now I'm real hip to all the stuff that they were talking about. Well, this man that had OD'd, well, that meant overdosed. And the word stuff, well, back then it had a very specific meaning. It meant heroin. So what had happened was that this man had taken a shot of heroin that was too strong, and it killed him. So that's what happened to this fellow. Well, by the time I was old enough to be hanging around with my friends and observing everybody getting high, I started to have in my mind all drugs lumped into that idea of stuff. Any drug, anything like that. If my old man caught me messing with that stuff, he'd put me in my grave. Now, I didn't actually think that that meant my father would literally kill me. But my dad was the kind of person that he never spoke with an empty threat. I could count maybe on the fingers on one hand and still have some left over the times that I got a beating from him. I remember them. There were so few, but they were so very specific. He was a tough guy. He had been raised in the Lower East Side of New York. And I wasn't willing to try to find out to what extent he was serious about this drug stuff. So it was a non-issue for me. If you would have looked at me hanging around with my friends, you would have thought I was part of the crowd. You would have thought I was a hippie druggie. I mean, I looked like them, and I hung out with them, and I wore the stuff they wore, but I didn't touch the stuff. That changed. One day in March of 1968, I was a sophomore in high school, 16 years old. Came home from school this day, and I noticed that my mom was very upset. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that my dad had not called home at his lunch hour. My dad had a habit of every day at lunch, he would just take a minute and pick up the phone and call my mom and say hello. This one particular day, he hadn't done that. With the amount of concern or interest that the average 16-year-old would probably have, I told her, hey, it's no big deal, no problem. He'll be home for dinner. Because my dad, you could set your watch by his arrival at home. Well, dinner time came and went. He didn't show up. About 9 o'clock that night, I stood looking out the front window into the driveway, and I didn't want to let my mom know that I was starting to get worried, but I was. And right about that time, this big black sedan pulled into the driveway. These three men got out, large individuals in my memory. They all had trench coats and these hats. It looked like a scene out of some old grade B Hollywood detective movie. They came to the door and identified themselves as FBI agents. We let them in. They started questioning my mom, firing these questions at her. Where was your husband going this morning when he left? What was he wearing? What was he driving? Was he meeting anyone? Just peppering her with all these questions. And my poor mom was trying her best to answer, and every now and then she'd ask them what had happened, and they weren't telling her. So finally she said, I demand to know. I'm not going to answer anything else unless you tell me what happened. And I remember distinctly one of the three FBI agents who really seemed to be enjoying his job. He just blurted out with no compassion whatsoever in his voice, well, Mrs. Meyers, there was a man this morning shot and killed trying to hold up a bank, and we think it was your husband. Well, in the space of a split second, my entire life just changed completely forever. And the only way you could understand how traumatic and how shocking a thing that is if you, as you're listening to this, are a person who, at some point in your life, has